21. The bureaucracy of crime. Her confidence that unknown sins existed still waiting to be discovered altogether surprised me. I watched the limousine cross the plaza on its return to Estrella de Mar. Workmen were removing the Verkov and A Vendre signs from the untenanted retail units beside the supermarket. But the sports club remained silent. I walked around the empty building and listened to my feet ring on the polished floor. The Germans lounged by the pool, showing off their physiques to each other. A desultory traffic moved around the plaza, and by noon the Residencia Costa Sol was already preparing for its afternoon retreat from the sun. Despite myself, I felt responsible for the club's failure to attract new members and realized how depressed Frank must have been when he first arrived at the Club Nautico. I stood behind the concierge's counter, watching the waiters pace around the open-air bar and the groundsmen sweep the deserted tennis courts. I was pointlessly keyboarding the computer, adding up imaginary profits, when I heard the beat of a Porsche's engine thrumming through the sunlight. I reached the glass doors as Bobby Crawford crossed the car park. He sprinted up the steps, bounding on his powerful legs like an acrobat on a trampoline, an arm raised to greet me. He wore his black baseball cap and leather jacket, and carried a large sports bag in one hand. Seeing him, I felt my heart begin to race. "Charles, chin up. This isn't the House of Usher." He took the door from me and stepped into the foyer, eager smile exposing the iceberg whiteness of his polished teeth. "What's been happening? You look as if you're glad to see me." "I am. Nothing's happened." "That's the problem. I may be the wrong manager for you." "You're tired, Charles. Not a time to get depressed." Crawford glanced at the pool and tennis courts. A lot of hunk in place, but no customers. "Any new members?" "Not one. Maybe tennis isn't what the people here need." "Everyone needs tennis. The Residencia Costa Sol may not know it now, but it soon will." He turned to face me, beaming warmly and clearly happy to find me waiting for him, and already seeing my grumpy mood as one of the amusing foibles of a family retainer. He had been away for 4 days, and I was struck by how much more sharply tuned his movements were, as if he had installed a more powerful engine in the Porsche and drawn off part of its huge thrust for his own nervous system. Grimaces and little ticks crossed his face as 101 ideas jostled in his mind. "Things are going to happen here, Charles." He gripped my shoulder like an older brother, nodding his approval at the cash register. "Holding the fort isn't easy, let me tell you. Betty Shand is proud of what you've done." "I've done damn all. Nothing is going to happen here. The Residencia Costa Sol isn't your sort of place. This isn't Estrella de Mar, it's the Valley of the Brain Dead. I only wish I could help." "You can. By the way, I think I've found a house for you. Small swimming pool, tennis court. I'll bring over a tennis machine so you can practice your returns. First, I have a few calls to make. We'll take your car. I'd like you to drive. That slow and steady pace of yours soothes my headaches." "Of course," I pointed to the clock in the foyer. "Do you want to wait? It's 2:45. Everything here is in deep sleep." "Perfect. It's the most interesting time of day. People are either dreaming or having sex, perhaps both at the same time." As I started the engine, he settled himself into the passenger seat of the Citroën, one arm trailing out of the window and the hold-all between his legs. He nodded approvingly as I fastened my seatbelt. "Sensible, Charles. I do admire an orderly mind. It's hard to believe, but accidents happen even in the Residencia Costa Sol. The whole place is an accident. This is where the late 20th century ran into the buffers. Where do you want to go, the Club Nautico?" "No, we'll stay here." "Drive around, any route you like. I want to see how things are." We crossed the plaza and its deserted shopping mall, and then cruised past the marina and its ghost fleet of virtually mothballed yachts. I turned at random into one of the secondary residential avenues in the eastern quadrant of the complex. The detached villas stood in their silent gardens, surrounded by dwarf palms, oleanders and beds of cannas like frozen fire. Sprinklers swayed across the lawns, conjuring rainbows from the overlit air, local deities performing their dances to the sun. Now and then the sea wind threw a faint spray across the swimming pools, and their mirror surfaces clouded like troubled dreams. "Slow down a little," Crawford leaned forward, peering up at a large deco house on a corner site. A shared access road ran towards a group of 3-story apartment houses. Awnings flared over the balconies, tethered wings that would never touch the sky. "Stop here, this looks like it." What's the number? For some reason, people here refuse to identify themselves. I forget exactly, but this feels right. He pointed 50 yards beyond the access road, where the fronds of a huge cycad formed a pedestrian shelter. Park there and wait for me. He unzipped the holdall and removed what seemed to be a set of golf putters wrapped in an oilcloth. He stepped from the car, face hidden behind his peaked cap and dark glasses, patted the roof and set off in a light stride towards the drive. As I freewheeled down the slope to the cycad, my eyes on the rearview mirror, I saw him vault the side gate that led to the servants' entrance. I waited in the car, listening to the faint hiss of sprinklers from the walls and hedges around me. Perhaps the owners of the villa were away on holiday and a lover was waiting for him in another maid's room. I imagined them playing clock golf on the carpet, a formal courtship like the mating dance of a bower bird. Right, let's go. Crawford seemed to step from the screen of vegetation around the cycad. Under one arm, he carried a videocassette recorder, cables tied around it to form a black parcel. He placed it on the rear seat and loosened his cap, keeping a careful eye on the access road. I'm checking it for them, a couple called Hanley. He's a retired personnel manager from Liverpool. By the way, it looks as if I've recruited 2 new members. For the sports club? Great stuff. How did you persuade them? Their television set isn't working. Something's wrong with the satellite dish. Besides, they feel that they ought to get out more. Now let's drive over to the west side of the complex. I need to make a few house calls. He adjusted the climate control unit on the instrument panel, sending a stream of cooler air into our faces, and lay back against the headrest, so relaxed that I could hardly believe that we had embarked on a criminal spree. He stowed the golf putters in the holdall, deliberately allowing me to see that they were, in fact, a pair of steel jimmies. I had guessed from the moment we left the sports club that he intended to carry out a series of provocative acts, petty burglaries and nuisance raids designed to shake the Residencia Costa Sol out of its dozing complacency. I assumed that the crimes which the Spanish police had reported to David Hennessy were Crawford's doing, the overture to his campaign of harassment and aggravation. 20 minutes later, we stopped by the next villa, an imposing mansion in the Moorish style with a speedboat parked in its drive. Almost certainly the residents would be asleep in the bedrooms upstairs, and the garden and terrace were silent. A slow drip of water from a forgotten hose counted the seconds as Crawford scanned the surveillance cameras, his eyes following the cables that ran from the satellite dish on the roof to the switch box beside the patio doors. Leave the engine running, Charles. We may as well do this in style. He slipped away, disappearing among the trees that flanked the drive. My hands fretted at the wheel as I waited for him to return, ready to make a quick getaway. I smiled at an elderly couple who passed me in their car, a large spaniel sitting between them, but they seemed unconcerned by the Citroen's presence. 5 minutes later, Crawford slipped into the passenger seat, casually brushing a few splinters of glass from his jacket. More television trouble? I asked as we set off. It looks like it. Crawford sat straight-faced beside me, now and then taking the wheel from my nervous hands. These satellite dishes are very sensitive. They need to be constantly recalibrated. The owners will be grateful. Possible members? Do you know, I think they are. I wouldn't be surprised if they dropped in tomorrow. Crawford unzipped his jacket and removed an engraved silver cigarette case, which he laid beside the cassette recorder on the rear seat. The husband was a Queen's Club committee member, a keen tennis player. His wife used to be something of an amateur painter. Perhaps she'll take it up again? I think she might. We continued to make our calls, threading our way through the quiet avenues of the Residencia Costa Sol like a shuttle, weaving a rogue pattern across a sedate tapestry. Crawford pretended to visit the properties at random, but I took for granted that he had selected his victims after carrying out a careful survey, picking those who would send out the largest ripples of alarm. I imagined them dozing through the siesta hours as Crawford moved around the rooms below, sabotaging the satellite systems, stealing a jade horse from a coffee table, a Staffordshire figure from a mantelpiece, rifling the desk drawers as if in search of cash or jewelry, creating the illusion that a gang of skilled housebreakers had taken up residence in the Costa Sol complex. While I waited in the car, expecting Inspector Cabrera and the Fuengirola flying squad to seize me on the spot, I wondered why I'd allowed Crawford to inveigle me into this criminal romp. As the Citroen's engine trembled against the accelerator pedal, I was tempted to drive back to the sports club and tip off Cabrera. But Crawford's arrest would put an end to any hopes of discovering the arsonist who had murdered the Hollingers. Looking up at the hundreds of impassive villas, with their security cameras and mentally embalmed owners, I was sure that Crawford's attempts to transform the complex into another Estrella de Mar would fail. The people of the residency had not only traveled to the far side of boredom, but had decided that they liked the view. Crawford's failure might well provoke him into a desperate act that would expose his complicity in the Hollinger killers. One fire too many would burn more than his fingers. Yet his commitment to this bizarre social experiment had a charm all its own. Frank, too, I guessed, had been seduced by his gaudy vision. And like Frank, I said nothing as the rear seat of the Citroën accumulated its booty. By the sixth villa, one of the older mansions on the north-south radial boulevard, I found a blanket in the trunk and held it ready for Crawford when he emerged from the shrubbery with a wasted Ming vase under one arm, a blackwood stand under the other. He patted me reassuringly as I draped the blanket over his treasure trove, pleasantly surprised by the way in which I had held up under pressure. "They're tokens, Charles. I'll see they find their way back to the owners. Strictly speaking, we don't need to take anything, just convey the sense that a thief has urinated on their Persian carpets and wiped with his fingers on the tapestry. And tomorrow the entire residency at Costa Sol will feel like a game of tennis? Or decide to take up flower arranging and needle points? Of course not. The inertial forces here are colossal. But one elephant fly can start a stampede if it bites a sensitive spot. You sound skeptical." "A little. You don't think it will work?" Crawford pressed my hand to the steering wheel, steeling my resolve. "I need you, Charles. It's difficult to do this on my own. Betty Shand and Hennessy are only interested in their cash flow, but you can see beyond that to the larger horizon. What happened in Estrella de Mar will happen here, and then move on down the coast. Think of all those pueblos coming to life again. We're freeing people, Charles, returning them to their true selves." Did he believe his own rhetoric? Half an hour later, as he burgled a small apartment block near the Central Plaza, I unzipped the holdall and glanced through its contents. There were jimmies and wire cutters, a selection of lockpicks and perforated entry cards, jump leads and electronic immobilizers. A small valise contained several aerosol paint cans, 2 camcorders, and a clutch of fresh videocassettes. A segmented plastic snake of cocaine sachets wrapped itself around a wallet filled with drug capsules and pills and foil dispensers, packs of syrettes and ribbed condoms. The aerosols Crawford put to immediate use. Barely bothering to step from the car, he held a can in each hand and sprayed a series of lurid patterns on the garage doors that we passed. After only 2 hours, a lengthy trail of theft and vandalism lay behind us. Damaged satellite dishes, graffiti-daubed cars, dog turds left floating in swimming pools, surveillance cameras blinded by jets of paint. Within earshot of the owners, he broke into a silver Aston Martin and freewheeled the car down the graveled drive. I followed as he drove to a disused builder's yard on the northern perimeter road and watched him scrape the sides of the car with a jimmy, scratching the paintwork with the care of a chef scoring a side of pork. When he stood back and lit a cigarette, I waited for the fire to come. He smiled at the mutilated vehicle, the lighter still flaming in his hand, and I expected him to stuff a rag in the fuel tank. But Crawford treated the car to a rueful salute and calmly smoked his cigarette when we drove off, savoring the Turkish fumes. "I hate doing that, Charles, but sacrifices have to be made." "At least it's not your Aston Martin." "I was thinking of our sacrifices. It's painful medicine for both of us, but we have to swallow it." We set off along the perimeter road where the cheaper villas and apartment houses looked out over the Malaga highway. Homemade for sale signs hung from balconies, and I assumed that the Dutch-German developers had sold the properties at a discount. "Take that house on the right, the one with the empty pool." Crawford pointed to a small villa with a faded awning over its patio. A drying frame exposed a selection of gaudy tops and flimsy underwear to the sun. "I'll be back in 10 minutes. They need a little arts counseling." He reached into the holdall and removed the valise that contained the camcorders and pharmaceuticals. Waiting for him by the front door were 2 women in swimsuits who shared the villa. Despite the heat, they wore a full maquillage of lipstick, rouge, and mascara, as if ready for a session under the film lights, and greeted Crawford with the easy smiles of hostesses at a dubious bar welcoming a regular patron. The younger of the women was in her 20s, with a pale English complexion, bony shoulders, and eyes that forever watched the street. I recognized the older woman beside her, the platinum blonde with the overlarge breasts and florid face who had played one of the bridesmaids in the porno film. Glass in hand, she pressed a Slavic cheekbone to Crawford's lips and beckoned him into the house. I stepped from the car and strolled towards the house, watching them through the patio windows. Together they made their way into the lounge, where a television set played to itself, blinking as the frame hold lost its grip on an afternoon serial. Crawford opened the valise and took out one of the camcorders and a brace of cassettes. He tore a dozen sachets of cocaine from the plastic snake, which the women tucked into the cups of their swimsuits, and began to demonstrate the camcorder to them. The older woman raised the viewfinder to her eye, snapping it herself as her long fingernails scratched at the tiny push buttons. She practiced the pan and zoom, while Crawford sat on the sofa with the young Englishwoman. No one exchanged the slightest banter, as if Crawford were a salesman demonstrating a new household appliance. When he returned to the car, the women filmed him from the door, laughing over each other's shoulders. "Film school?" I asked. "They look like quick learners." "Yes, they've always been film buffs," Crawford waved to them as we pulled away, grinning to himself as if genuinely fond of the women. "They came here from the Estepona to open a beauty parlor, but decided the prospects weren't good enough. So now they'll go into the film business. I imagine they'll find that profitable." "I think so. They have an idea for a film." "Documentary?" "More of a nature film, you might call it. The wildlife of the Residencia Costa Sol." I savored the notion. "Courtship rituals and mating patterns. I think they'll be a success." "Who is the platinum blonde? She looks slightly Russian." "Reza Livingston, widow of a Lambeth bookie. She's a tank trap full of vodka. A great sport. She's done a little acting before, so she'll get things off to a good start." Crawford spoke without irony, staring at the roof of the car as if already screening the first day's rushes. He seemed content with his afternoon's work, like a neighborhood evangelist who had unloaded his stock of biblical tracts. The burglaries and break-ins had left him calm and relaxed, his day's duty done for the benighted people of the Residencia. When we returned to the sports club, he directed me to the service entrance behind the kitchen and boiler room. Here he had parked his Porsche, safely out of sight from any police who might call at the club. "We'll move the gear to my car." He threw back the blanket, exposing the booty. "I don't want Cabrera to catch you red-handed, Charles. You've got that guilty look again. There's a lot of stuff here. Can you remember who owns what?" "I don't need to. I'll stash it in the builder's yard where we left the Aston Martin and tip off the security people in the gatehouse. They'll put everything on show there and make sure the entire Residencia gets the message." "But what is the message? That's something I haven't quite grasped." "The message." Crawford was lifting a cassette recorder from the seat, but turned to stare at me. "I thought you understood everything, Charles." "Not exactly. These break-ins, wrecking a few TV sets, and painting fuck on a garage door. Is that going to change people's lives? If you burgled my house, I'd just call the police. I wouldn't join a chess club or take up carol singing." "Absolutely, you'd call the police. So would I. But suppose the police do nothing and I break in again, this time stealing something you really value. You'd start thinking about stronger locks and a security camera." "So?" I opened the Porsche's boot and waited as Crawford lowered the cassette recorder into it. "We've returned to square one. I go back to my satellite television and my long sleep of the dead." "No, Charles," Crawford spoke patiently. "You're not asleep. By now you're wide awake. More alert than you've ever been before. The break-ins are like the devout Catholic's wristlet that chafes the skin and sharpens the moral sensibility. The next burglary fills you with anger, even a self-righteous rage. The police are useless, fobbing you off with vague promises, and that generates a sense of injustice, a feeling that you're surrounded by a world without shame. Everything around you, the paintings and silverware you've taken for granted, fit into this new moral framework. You're more aware of yourself. Dormant areas of your mind that you haven't visited for years become important again. You begin to reassess yourself as you did, Charles, when the Renault caught fire. Perhaps, but I didn't take up Tai Chi or start a new book. Wait, you may do, Crawford pressed on, keen to convince me. The process takes time. The crime wave continues. Someone shits in your pool. ransacks your bedroom, and plays around with your wife's underwear. Now, rage and anger are not enough. You're forced to rethink yourself on every level, like primitive man confronting a hostile universe behind every tree and rock. You're aware of time, chance, the resources of your own imagination. Then someone mugs the woman next door, so you team up with the outraged husband. Crime and vandalism are everywhere. You have to rise above these mindless thugs and the oafish world they inhabit. Insecurity forces you to cherish whatever moral strengths you have, just as political prisoners memorize Dostoevsky's House of the Dead, the dying play Bach, and rediscover their faith. Parents mourning a dead child do voluntary work at a hospice. We realize time is finite and take nothing for granted anymore. Exactly, Crawford patted my arm, happy to welcome me to his flock. We form watch committees, elect a local council, take pride in our neighborhoods, join sports clubs and local history societies, rediscover the everyday world we once took for granted. We know that it's more important to be a third-rate painter than to watch a CD-ROM on the Renaissance. Together we begin to thrive and at last find our full potential as individuals and as a community. And all this is set off by crime? I lifted the silver cigarette case from the rear seat of the Citroen. Why that particular trigger? Why not religion or some kind of political will? They've ruled the world in the past. Not any longer. Politics is over, Charles. It doesn't touch the public imagination any longer. Religions emerged too early in human evolution. They set up symbols that people took literally. And they're as dead as a line of totem poles. Religions should have come later, when the human race begins to near its end. Sadly, crime is the only spur that rouses us. We're fascinated by that other world where everything is possible. Most people would say there's more than enough crime already, but not here. Crawford gestured with the jade horse at the distant balconies beyond the alley. Not in the Residencia Costa Sol, or the retirement complexes along the coast. The future has landed, Charles. The nightmare is already being dreamed. I believe in people and know they deserve better. You'll bring them back to life with amateur porn films, burglary, and cocaine? They're just the means. People are so hung up about sex and property and self-control. I'm not talking about crime in the sense that Cabrera thinks of it. I mean anything that breaks the rules, sidesteps the social taboos. You can't play tennis without observing the rules. But Charles, Crawford seemed almost lightheaded as he searched for a retort. When your opponent cheats, think how you raise your game. We carried the last of the stolen property to the Porsche. I walked back to my car, ready to leave Crawford. But he opened the door and slipped into the passenger seat. The sun shone through the side windows of the Citroen, flushing his face with an almost fevered glow. He had been eager for me to hear him out, but I sensed that he no longer cared if anyone believed him. Despite myself, I felt drawn to him, this small-time healer, moving like a mendicant preacher down the coasts of the dead. I knew that his ministry would almost certainly fail and lead to a cell in Zarzula jail. I hope it works, I told him. How did Frank feel about all this? Was it his idea? No, Frank's far too moralistic. I'd thought about it for years, in fact, ever since I was a child. My father was a deacon at Ely Cathedral. Unhappy man, never knew how to show affection to me or my mother. What he did like was knocking me around. Nasty. Did no one report him? They didn't know. Not even my mother. I was hyperactive and always banging into things. But I noticed it made him feel better. After a session with the strap, he'd hold me tight and even love me. So I started getting up to all kinds of naughty pranks just to provoke him. Painful medicine. And that gave you the idea. In a way, I found that thieving and little criminal schemes could stir things up. Father knew what was going on and never tried to stop me. At the choir school, he'd see me gingering up the boys before an away match, stealing from their lockers and messing up their kit. We always won by 6 tries to nil. The last time Father used the strap, he suggested I take holy orders. Did you? No, but I was tempted. I wasted a couple of years at Cambridge reading anthropology, played a lot of tennis, and then joined the army on a short service commission. The regiment went out to Hong Kong, working with the Kowloon police. A totally demoralized bunch. Morale was flat on the floor. They were waiting for the mainland Chinese to take over and send them all to Sinkiang. The villagers in the new territories were just as bad, already paying cumshaw to the Chinese border guards. They'd lost all heart, letting the paddy fields drain and making a pittance out of smuggling. But you put a stop to that. How exactly? I livened things up, a spot of thieving here and there, a few gallons of diesel oil in the kongs where they stored their rice. Suddenly everyone was sitting up, started rebuilding the dikes and cleaning the canals. And the Kowloon police, same thing. We had problems with cross-border migrants looking for the good life in Hong Kong. Instead of handing them back, we roughed them up a little first. That did the trick with the local police. Believe me, there's nothing like a war crime to perk up the soldiery. It's a terrible thing to say, but war crimes do have their positive side. It's a pity I couldn't have stayed on longer. I might have put some backbone into the colony. You had to leave? After a year, the colonel asked me to resign my commission. One of the Chinese sergeants got overenthusiastic. He didn't appreciate that he was taking part in a psychological experiment. I don't think he did. But it all stayed in my mind. I started playing a lot of tennis, worked at Rod Laver's club, and then came here. The curious thing is that Estrella de Mar and the Residencia Costa Sol are rather like Kowloon. He adjusted the rearview mirror and stared at his reflection, nodding to himself in confirmation. I'll leave you, Charles. Take care. Good advice. As he opened the door, I said, I assume it was you who tried to strangle me. I expected Crawford to be embarrassed, but he turned to stare at me with genuine concern, surprised by the stern note in my voice. Charles, that was a gesture of affection. It sounds strange, but I mean it. I wanted to wake you and make you believe in yourself. It's an old interrogation technique. One of the Kowloon inspectors showed me all the pressure points. It's amazingly effective at giving people a clearer perspective on everything. You needed to be roused, Charles. Look at you now. You're almost ready to play tennis with me. He held my shoulder in a friendly grip, saluted, and sprinted back to the Porsche. Later that evening, as I stood on the balcony of Frank's apartment at the Club Nautico, I thought of Bobby Crawford and the Kowloon police and that world of corrupt border officials and thieving villagers. A young English lieutenant with a taste for violence would have fitted in like a pickpocket in a Derby Day crowd. For all his strange idealism, the Residencia Costa Sol would defeat him. A few bored wives might film themselves having sex with their lovers, but the attractions of Tai Chi, madrigals, and volunteer committee work would soon pall. The sports club would remain deserted, leaving Elizabeth Shand to tear up her leases. I felt the bruises on my neck and realized that Crawford had been recruiting me when he stepped from the darkness and seized my throat. A laying on of hands had taken place as he appointed me to fill Frank's vacant role. By not injuring me, he had made the point that the Hollinger murders were irrelevant to the real life of Estrella de Mar and the new social order sustained by his criminal regime. Soon after midnight, I was woken by a flash of light across the bedroom ceiling. I stepped onto the balcony and searched for the beacon of the Marbella lighthouse, assuming that an electrical discharge had destroyed the lantern. But the beam continued its soft circuit of the sky. The flames leapt from the center of the Costa Sol Marina. A yacht was on fire, its mast glowing like a candle wick. Cut loose from its moorings, it drifted across the open water. A fire ship searching the darkness for a phantom fleet. But after scarcely a minute, the flames seemed to snuff themselves out, and I guessed that the yacht had sunk before Bobby Crawford could rouse the Costa Sol residents from a slumber even deeper than sleep. Already I suspected that the yacht was the Halcyon, and that Crawford had persuaded Anderson to sail the craft from its berth at Estrella de Mar, ready to signal his arrival to the peoples of his ministry. The next morning, when I passed the marina on my way to the sports club, a police launch circled the debris-strewn water. A small crowd stood on the quay, watching a frogman dive to the submerged sloop. The usually silent yachts and cruisers had begun to stir with activity. A few owners were testing their rigging and engines, while their wives aired the cabins and buffed the brass. Only Anderson sat quietly in the boatyard, face as bleak as ever, smoking a roll-up cigarette as he stared at the rising sails. I left him to his vigil and drove across the plaza to the club. A car turned through the gates ahead of me and parked by the entrance. Two middle-aged couples dressed in their crispest tennis whites stepped nimbly from the car, rackets swinging in their hands. "Mr. Prentice, good morning to you." One of the husbands, a retired dentist I had seen in the wine store, strolled up to me. "We're not members, but we'd like to join. Can you sign us up?" "Of course." I shook his hand and beckoned the party towards the entrance. "You'll be glad to know that the first year's membership is entirely free." Bobby Crawford's first recruits were signing on for duty.